Good morning, everybody, and our distinguished guest, ladies and gentlemen. It is our distinguished pleasure to invite you to the session on Global Non-Proliferation Review. This is a session we conduct every year as part of our annual review on the global status of nuclear proliferation or non-proliferation and talk about what we see and what we do. Problem of non-proliferation or nuclear proliferation is global, and any effort, any effective response must be multilateral and global. We currently have 5 nuclear weapon states, 4 states known or believed to have nuclear weapons. We have a continued diffusion of technology, dual-use technologies, and technological know-how to the sensitive part of the technological development is becoming accessible and available to anybody, including non-state actors. And while the global community's commitment to substantial nuclear arms reduction or nuclear non-proliferation remains somewhat questionable these days, interest in nuclear arms race is reignited, and also the development of nuclear technology continues throughout the world. And as we all know, we have Mr. President Trump at the White House, who is changing the landscape of nuclear proliferation or non-proliferation. So this session is to examine where we stand and hopefully find a way for the future. This session aims at providing the review of the current status, examining the nature, today's challenges, and exploring the path for the future. The questions we ask in this session include, is international security in the world improving? Is the need for nuclear weapons increasing? Does the nuclear non-proliferation regime remain effective? Is the state's capability for potentially acquiring nuclear weapons increasing? What are the implications of new emerging technologies in nuclear non-proliferation or proliferation? What should be done today for the global community to be prepared for the future challenges? So we have invited 6 very distinguished speakers. Unfortunately, one of the speakers is not here. Professor Sagan from Stanford, we just heard him. Professor Steve Miller from Harvard. He is the director of International Security Program and is an editor-in-chief for the journal International Security. I believe these 2 gentlemen represent 2 pillars of the community. Professor Shen Dingli from Fudan University, former executive dean at the Fudan University, is one of the true scientists of policy expert representing the Chinese nuclear policy community or international relations. And then this year we have done something different. So to my left side, we have 3, supposed to be 3, but 2 young stars. Dr. Eunjeong, she is one of our former research fellow, NEREC research fellow. She has a degree in political science from Warwick University, and is currently working as a research fellow at National Security Institute for National Security Strategy. And also we have Leah Matchett, former NEREC Summer Fellows, and also current student of political science at Stanford University. Leah graduated from University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, summa cum laude, and then got MPhil from Oxford University International Security. Now she is working for a PhD degree in international relations, and I'm sure she will talk about more. So the students sitting to my left, or the young stars sitting to my left, represent the future. And maybe the leaders in the community and the future leaders in of the community may have some differences, a different perspective for the problem. So we want to hear that. So without any further ado, I'd like to first invite Professor Sagan. Any comments you want to make? And then we go to Professor Steve Miller.
I'm going to be very brief because you've already heard from me. I just wanted to reiterate a major point about North Korea that we did not have a chance to discuss at length, which is the importance, if we are able to move forward with Ambassador Begin meeting with his North Korean counterparts, to accept what Ambassador Began pointed out when he visited Stanford in the winter, that some kind of step-by-step approach rather than a all or nothing approach is necessary. A step-by-step approach would give up some sanctions relief in exchange for some denuclearization progress and could at least get us started rather than be in the stalled position we are in today. That may mean that we'll have to accept North Korean nuclear weapons for a considerable amount of time, but that's better than having the current stalemate with no constraints at all. And I can see two things going forward there that would be helpful. One is that I believe that we could turn an informal agreement about what missiles can be launched and what can't be into a formal agreement so we know where the exact lines are, and do the same with exercises. Second, I believe it would be useful to have an equivalent of what we had during the Cold War that were called the Dangerous Military Activities Agreement, where at the time Soviet and later Russian military forces at sea or in the air knew what the procedures were for emergencies, knew not to shine lasers on each other, knew what kinds of activities were considered to be appropriate monitoring and what were considered harassment that could lead to an exchange. Because we have no such agreements between the DPRK and the US, much less the DPRK and the ROK. Am I optimistic or pessimistic? I must say I'm somewhat pessimistic that we can move forward on this, because if I were the North Koreans, I would look at what the United States has done with other arms control agreements and say, why should we trust that they'll keep an agreement that they have signed? I hope I'm wrong on that, because I think these kinds of agreements are absolutely necessary, and I do think that the next president of the United States, regardless, post-President Trump, regardless of whether it is a Republican sometime in the future or a Democrat, is more likely to try to pursue traditional arms control than the anti-arms control positions that have been taken by this administration.
It's always a pleasure to have the opportunity to join the NEREC conference. Scott and I are two of the few people, I think, who've participated in all 6 of these events, proving with our presence that we see the value in this exercise. This is a kind of overview panel which is meant to sketch the broad features of the nonproliferation scene as I understand it. We were given a series of questions to address. The first of which is the international security in the world improving? So I thought I would start very briefly by answering that question. No. So, I think it's worth, before focusing in on the specifics of the nuclear proliferation scene, to note that the wider international context is growing much more difficult. Great power relations have grown much more complicated. U.S.-Russian relations have deteriorated very significantly, President Trump's wishes notwithstanding. China and the U.S. are now in an intensifying rivalry. It's not clear how severe that will be, but it's very clear that it's going to be a complicated issue to manage. America's alliance system is no longer robust, and in fact has been called into question both in Asia and in Europe by President Trump. We have worrying regional nuclear orders that are difficult to manage and raise their own sets of problems and risks. And overarching all of this has been a very substantial collapse of arms control more broadly. We've witnessed the death of the INF Treaty just a couple of days ago, but earlier the Trump administration withdrew from the JCPOA very famously. They withdrew from the arms trade agreement. There's only one nuclear arms control agreement left, and it expires in February of 2021. So we have a much more difficult political diplomatic environment and many fewer constraints and regulatory structures to contain the rivalries that we see. So that's the wider canvas in which all of these non-proliferation issues are playing out. And I think it has some direct implications simply because the more disharmonious the relations are between the major actors, the harder it is to act in concert for prudent and constructive steps in nonproliferation. Now, to set the stage a little bit for our discussion the next day and a half on nuclear proliferation issues, seems to me it's worthwhile to think in terms of the run-up to the 2020 NPT Review Conference, which will take place in the first half of next year. This will be the 10th NPT Review Conference. It will be the 50th anniversary since the entry into force of the treaty. In principle, a big and celebratory event. But in fact, what we see is some storm clouds gathering, and every likelihood that what we will see in 2020 is another collision, another NPT Review Conference that is chalked up in the history books as a failure. About half of them actually have been regarded as failures by one measure or another. And so what is it that I think is problematic? And the answer falls into two categories. One is the familiar issues, and the other is distinctive questions of the moment. Starting with distinctive questions of the moment, we have, among other things, the Trump administration's assault on the JCPOA, the Iran deal, which most of the world looks upon favorably, a few actors dislike, but Trump has denounced and refused to comply with. This is likely to be a very controversial issue at the NPT Review Conference next year, and I believe that most of the world will be against us, and the United States and Israel and Saudi Arabia, maybe one or two others, will be very isolated, and that's likely to be a very acrimonious discussion, not least because the JCPOA represented a diplomatic approach to addressing a difficult nonproliferation problem, and it managed to incorporate an array of unprecedented measures, both constraints on facilities and activities, but also unprecedented in the degree of transparency that it built into the arrangement. And so from a nonproliferation point of view, the JCPOA looked like an innovation and advancement and improvement on the situation, a possible model for dealing with other future problems, and possibly some features of it applicable even in the case of the Korean Peninsula. We have, of course, the North Korean problem, which continues to fester, and I won't say more about that because there will be much more on that later in the program. But we're also likely to see at the NPT Review Conference a collision of some long-standing issues where there are two factions, in a sense. On the Western / Washington side, there's concerns about inadequate export controls, about insufficient transparency of the regime, about difficulties and worries about the detection, the adequate detection of cheating. In Washington, there is a very acute concern about the failure of the regime to effectively respond to cheating. If bad guys can get away with cheating, then what is the value of the regime? And there are a whole array of potential remedies that involve allowing the IAEA much more intrusiveness, about much more restrictive export control regulations, which Washington views with great favor and which are absolutely rejected by the large majority of members of the NPT. On the other side, what you might call the non-aligned movement perspective, but reflecting probably the views of about 150 member states of the NPT, are beliefs that the core bargain of the NPT is not being respected by the nuclear weapon states, that this transaction of nuclear weapon disarmament and constraints in return for constraints on non-nuclear weapon states, the notion that the non-nuclear weapon states would pledge to forsake nuclear weapons in return for pledges of disarmament activity from the nuclear weapon states, the notion that the non-nuclear weapon states should have unfettered open access to civilian nuclear technologies, whereas the suppliers have over the years built up an increasingly restrictive nuclear supplier arrangement. These grievances, reciprocal grievances, get aired and played out in very intense ways at these NPT review conferences. The non-nuclear weapon states, many of them believe that their rights are being truncated or removed, the Article 4 rights of access to nuclear technology. With measures like the additional protocol, there's resentment that additional burdens are being imposed on the non-nuclear weapon states when in fact the weapon states largely exempt themselves and their friends from much of the scrutiny and many of the rules. There's a sense that the rules are enforced very unevenly depending on whether you're close to or hostile with Washington or other Western powers. There's a particular sub-grievance having to do with the Arab states, intense grievance that somehow they are subjected to unusually intense scrutiny, whereas Israel is exempted from all accountability. And then finally, something that I have on the list of grievances, and something that I find substantial worry about when I travel around to meetings thinking about the upcoming NPT Review Conference, is the combination of very substantial modernization programs, long-term modernization programs, in all of the substantial nuclear weapon states, including especially Russia and the United States, combined with the near total collapse of arms control, makes it very hard for the nuclear weapon states to mobilize a credible explanation that persuades people that they are in fact paying any allegiance at all to their Article 6 disarmament obligations under the NPT. This has been a perennial issue. You can find traces of it all the way back to the very first NPT Review Conference in 1975. But in recent years, since the end of the Cold War, there have been much higher hopes about the prospects for arms control and disarmament, much higher expectations on the part of the non-aligned movement and other nuclear weapon states that there will be greater fidelity to Article 6 obligations. And what we see instead is greater and greater divergence of the behavior of the nuclear weapon states in relation to the Article 6 obligations. In the United States of America, we are launched on a 30-year, $1.7 trillion nuclear modernization program that aims to update and modernize every single element of our nuclear capability, including the nuclear weapons complex. And by 2050, we aim to have in place a new deployed arsenal whose life expectancy measures in many decades, meaning what we are envisioning in the United States is something like the current arsenal, and maybe more because of the decay of US-Russian relations to the end of this century. So this makes it much more difficult to address the Article 6 question effectively in the context of the 2020 Review Conference. And with the assault on arms control as well, the usual argument that we've made progress and we're taking steps no longer holds because, in fact, the steps have been backwards rather than forwards. And then the final category of issues or concerns that I think needs to be touched on for a moment is the fact that we have an administration in the United States that contains within it very influential people who are extremely skeptical of the value of the NPT regime. The National Security Advisor, Mr. John Bolton, is part of a small group of extremely conservative forces in the United States who has associated himself with the view that the NPT is worse than worthless. Not worthless, worse than worthless, because it creates the illusion that something effective is being done about proliferation when in fact the regime has proven inadequate ever to adequately address a serious cheating problem. This is a regime that has a number of people among its senior ranks, including Mr. Bolton and the Secretary of State, who believe that regime change is the only reliable non-proliferation policy. This is a group that has already demonstrated in a whole variety of contexts, the Paris Climate Change Agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and many others, and all relevant arms control agreements, that it views multilateral regimes as undesirable, as disadvantageous to the United States, as barriers to effective action by Washington. And so in the context of views like that, I don't think we have in the current American administration any inclination to make concessions or compromises or find finessing arguments to avoid a collision and a failure at the 2020 Review Conference. So on that happy note, I will conclude. I think I've stayed within my 15 minutes, and I'll pass the microphone over to my colleague, Dingli Shen.
Well, I appreciate Mansong's kind invitation. Annually, we address the same subject, the year's nuclear nonproliferation in review. So from last year to this time, I would review 3 items. First is the good news, DPRK. DPRK has been less angry with the US and with ROK. And Trump used to say fury and fire, 烈火和怒火. And now he is saying, I fall in love with Kim Jong-un. That made my leader, President Xi, very upset. North Korea is my cheese. Don't touch. I can punish my cheese. You cannot punish my cheese. And you cannot allure my cheese to your side. So if you are going to abandon your principle, I'm going to meet with Kim Jong-un 5 times in 15 months. The 2 leaders never meet in the last 5 years, but then they suddenly meet for 5 times. That made North Korea to feel that its US strategy is successful. North Korean leader considers that China is their backer. But if China would back America to use the platform, the UN, to punish North Korea, they need to find a way. And they smartly discover China-US are deepening their distrust on almost everything, especially on Taiwan, Hong Kong, and tariff. So best the time for them to play the trick, and they succeed. I don't know how much China has offered to North Korea, but China must make North Korea feel more comfortable now. Because North Korea is going to abandon nuclear weapons. That's good. China supports that. So that's good news. North Korea, due to China, US, South Korea, and our collaborative effort, North Korea is making commitment. They are going to abandon. How to abandon? From CVID to FFID. That's some change. US seem to make some concession. You don't need to do irreversible, verifiable, but you need to do comprehensive denuclearization. But what means comprehensive? Comprehensive must mean there is no loophole. The 2 sides met in Singapore that I reviewed a year ago. That set the principle. But then how to turn their words to action. And they have huge difficulties. Because comprehensive means you leave nothing there. You have to open your stuff to make a US to trust North Korea. In Hanoi, second round, US demanded to inspect some facility, which the DPRK was not prepared that the US would suggest. And they don't know how to respond. To open it, then they may lose some facility. Not to open it, then they don't get the U.S. trust. Therefore, the U.S. has more reason not to return to the DPRK for lifting at least part of the UN-based sanctions. That the second round collapsed. But why I say it's good news? Because at least North Korea recommitted and say if it's not comprehensive, it's a phased program, North Korea may be more willing. Who knows? But maybe more willing. China must be pushing for this. And China would not tell North Korea you can keep a nuclear weapon. China hates. But if they are willing to abandon at least part of their ability, and while retaining part of their current capability, and don't open up new capability, this is something China would be prepared. And based upon how US, North Korea would bilaterally respond to each other in a positive, constructive mood, North Korea is hopeful to abandon all in a certain time frame. So China must appreciate North Korea. Due to our effort with the US, due to our increasing interaction with North Korea, they are more willing to abandon some of their capability. Then we would blame the US. Why don't you are not prepared that North Korea is going to retain some of its capability for a while? Americans should reward the North Korean because they are abandoning some capability, or at least restrain some of their capability. So I predicted that the two sides, Pyongyang and Washington, would meet again. US would understand if it keeps current stand, nothing would happen. North Korea would understand if they are not willing to open up the mentioned facility to the US, nothing would happen. Either no third meeting or they prepare to give mutual concession. The second likelihood is, in my view, bigger. I expect them to come with more compromise. And through engagement, they are going to build the culture. Don't do everything at one time. Do it step by step, incrementally. So this is what Steve has mentioned, diplomacy. I'm very happy the Trump administration is still going to use diplomacy, not a kind of a pure threat. The bad news is the second item I'm going to raise. Through threat, rather than diplomacy, to coerce Iran to do more and to do better. Iran may not be perfect in being obliged to JCPOA, but it is already much better that Iran has committed not to build a nuclear weapon. It's a double commitment. Then it's a commitment to NPT plus JCPOA. But the US should assure not to threaten Iran. If Iran would violate to a certain extent, more UN punishment, more concerted, collaborative, punitive action against it, rather than unilateral or multilateral withdrawal from this instrument. But the same US government seems to be unable to apply its diplomacy everywhere. For on the issue of JCPOA, it bluntly, unilaterally withdraw. This is new from what I reviewed in Daejeon last year. Then China and other P4 and plus Germany, we lose America, but we don't want to lose this instrument. It is a machine. We want to assure Iran we will continue to help. As long as you guys would still commit to non-proliferation through verified means, through not to enrich uranium to a certain level beyond our agreement, we are going to still to buy your oil, regardless the US punishment. So China is still buying Iran's oil and probably escorting it through Chinese Navy destroyer. Don't touch our transporter. and we were committed to our paper bond obligation. China may reduce some of its importation, but China would tell the US, we are international community. We represent the UN, and you are violating the UN endorsed P5+1. So you are hurting diplomacy and international partnership. Regrettably, Iran is enriched uranium to a high degree, but still within certain restraint. I hope we will continue to engage the US and Iran to bring them together. The good news is that 10 minutes before shooting with the US air-based missile against Iran, because it adorned a US drone, the Trump administration ordered it to stop. It's not a diplomacy, but at least it's not a unilateral military action. Then the US said, US has donned an Iranian drone. Iran said nothing happened. If it had happened, I hope Iran would excise, restrain, as Trump administration has excised. So it's a very intricate, a very delicate balance of threat and self-restraint. But the message is not good. It's more dangerous than a year ago. Finally, INF. It's a US-Russian matter. I do doubt Russia has violated INF. But whether this should trigger the US to withdraw from the INF, then the two sides would receive no legal obligation. They could do whatever they want to do to develop their land-based INF. I think the US has been doing too much. Even if Russia has violated to a certain degree, we should still launch a UN-based investigation to make things clear and to hold Russia accountable, rather than to withdraw, to give Russia more freedom and to give US freedom. And China has already had freedom. When the INF was cut, China received freedom. Then US regret. China has enjoyed too much freedom. Let's compete with US. US may have more money, but the US needs to spend lots of money to beat China. And China now has enough money to beat the US. It's a total irresponsible start of dangerous interaction. And if China would do more, India would feel physically more threatened. And that would excite this link of action and counteraction. In East Asia, in South Asia, in Middle East, and in Eurasia. Already there is US Commander-in-Chief of the PACOM, now it's called the Indo-Pacific Com, to threat. As long as the White House would make a decision, he is to wipe out the Chinese establishment. And a dean of international relations school at a reputed Beijing-based university has stated China can knock out the US military asset in Asia Pacific easily, in 20 minutes. Both sides have such a crazy people. And when they are raising the stake higher and higher on tariff, today China's currency exchange rate has been $1 bigger than 7 Chinese yuan. So China would do more of this to counter the US raising tariff. The two countries are racing with a very dangerous, negative, destructive interaction. That may make them to be more able to misperceive, misunderstanding, and take very destructive action against each other. So my review of the situation concerning non-proliferation is certainly not a positive. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. My name is Leah Matchett. I'm a PhD student at Stanford. Many of the other panelists today have discussed modern substantive proliferation challenges. In contrast, I want to suggest that not only the substance, but also the forum which these international efforts to curb proliferation take are essential to their success. The legitimacy of the international nonproliferation regime and its future depends not only on the outcomes of these agreements, but also by the process by which they are achieved. Moreover, a loss of legitimacy negatively affects outcomes. I hope today to use the case of the Nuclear Security Summit to suggest that exclusion in the process of nonproliferation and nuclear regimes can lead to previously unexpected consequences and decrease outcomes for everyone involved. Briefly, I'm going to introduce a little bit of the context of how international organization has been changing, talk about the Nuclear Security Summit for those of you who don't have a background in it, although many people in this room probably participated, and then discuss two things. First, how do states respond when they're excluded from an organization? And two, what are the consequences of that response? Finally, I hope to conclude with a few notes on how the nonproliferation regime is affected by the aftermath of the Nuclear Security Summit and exclusionary regimes more generally. So if you look at international organization through time, you basically see that more recent international organizations are significantly smaller than previous organizations. In the direct post-war period, many of the international organizations that are formed are really large. This is predominantly UN and UN-style organizations. Much later, you begin to see organizations that are 3, 5, 10, or 20 members based around regional or issue area-specific things. Particularly, you begin to see this hyper-concentration after the 1970s. And there's a lot of reasons this could occur. It's possible that the multilateral regime has been solved and we need no more organization at the full national level. However, it's also possible that there's a lot of frustration with the multilateral regime. If you look throughout the policy literature and the academic literature on multilateralism, there's a surprising amount of pessimism as to the efficacy of these regimes. Policymakers talk about the objective difficulty of large groups. They discuss the way that individual states can act as spoilers. Formal theorists discuss transformation and information costs associated with larger groups, all with the assumption that a smaller group is somehow inherently better. One author concluded in 2012 that the days of permissive consensus for multilateralism are over. The problem with this is that it's not always entirely clear what the alternative to multilateralism is. One suggestion has been a move to so-called mini-lateralism. That is to say, exclusionary or semi-exclusionary smaller form organizations. This was described by Name in a 2009 foreign policy piece as basically having the smallest possible number of states who are relevant to the issue at hand at the table, only involving those states, and hoping to achieve substantive progress on a kind of piecemeal scale. There's also the suggestion that these groups could then be used to form an initial agreement and take it to the broader international level. There's been some pushback against this idea with suggestions that not only is it normatively problematic, because you're excluding those states which the organizer deems unimportant, but it also may lead to backlash among those states. As early as 1985, two particularly famous international organization theorists suggested that, this is pretty dark, but suggested that negotiations would be most successful when you have a small group, except for the fact that those excluded states would create so much friction that the overall outcomes would be negative. Oops, wrong way. This brings me to the Nuclear Security Summit. So the Nuclear Security Summit was actually a series of 4 summits organized from 2010 to 2016 by the Obama administration. It was announced formally in the 2009 Prague speech that had became wildly famous. And the context for all of this was the immense popularity of President Barack Obama and the sense of America's return to the world and recommitment to nonproliferation and disarmament. There was intense international interest in the summit, and particularly in Obama himself and the US's re-engagement with the community. However, the US didn't want to have an entirely open format. They worried that there would be efficacy problems. They wouldn't be able to achieve any real progress if they had every state available come. So they decided to organize the summit through an exclusive means by issuing invitations to a set number of countries, which then had the opportunity to attend and negotiate. Summits issued both consensus-based communiques at the end of every summit and also opt-in initiatives that were known as gift baskets, where willing states could sign on to additional commitments, but if a state wasn't willing, it wouldn't prevent forward progress. Overall, the main goals of the Nuclear Security Summit were twofold. On the one hand, a big goal of the summit was substantive. There was a lot of emphasis among the Obama administration officials on reducing the availability of nuclear materials to potential for nuclear terrorism. But on the other hand, there was an often overlooked but very relevant goal to support and extend the nuclear security infrastructure at an international level. Nuclear security has historically been dealt with in smaller, semi-technical groups in a variety of different regimes. And as Laura Holgate said, who's as one of the chief organizers of the summit, in her mind, one of the main goals of this process was to energize, enhance, empower, and elevate the existing nonproliferation regime. So the Nuclear Security Summit presents us with an example of an exclusionary regime where we trade off between substantive progress and this potential broader relational goal. It gives us an opportunity to understand how states who were not invited and might have been invited reacted. And this in turn helps us to understand how legitimacy affects outcomes and how future nonproliferation organizations speak to the future of the regime. Overall, I'm going to briefly speak today to three large ideas. These are very big questions, which I will only answer a part of. But the first is, do states care about the fairness of institutions? Do states care when they are excluded? Secondly, if they do care, what is the effect of their exclusion? Does it matter that the excluded states don't care if we make so much progress within the exclusionary organization that it's fine that they have this kind of backlash? Finally, bringing this back to the broader future of the nonproliferation effort, how does the Nuclear Security Summit relate to the US's future nonproliferation efforts and more organizations that we may form in the future? So on the first effort, I'm going to propose that states excluded from an organization experience negative reaction towards it. This follows the basic high school logic that if you don't invite someone to your party, they get mad at you. There's a lot of international relations theory and justice is fairness. We can talk about it afterwards if you want, but the basic idea is that not only the outputs that come out of your organization matter to how other states perceive it, but also the process by which those outcomes are achieved. What we see is that after the Nuclear Security Summit, there is a very strong and frankly negative backlash among the excluded states in Vienna. This is most clearly seen by the fact that you can't bring up the Nuclear Security Summit in consensus-based organizations because the excluded states will immediately point out that it was negotiated in an exclusionary context and has no applicability to the IAEA, which is a consensus-based organization. I performed 20-some interviews with officials from 13 different countries, and more than half of them individually brought this up without me asking. Ambassador Laura Holgate, who was a chief architect of the summit, spoke clearly that this was making her work in Vienna after the summit harder. Not only did this affect direct mention of the Nuclear Security Summit, but even trying to move forward ideas that were brought up within the Nuclear Security Summit could be tainted if states thought that the Nuclear Security Summit states were somehow colluding to push their agenda on the other states. Ambassador Grossi also spoke about the fact that states that weren't a part of this organization felt as though they were missing as part of an exclusive club and pushed back against the organization on this grounds. Now, the problem with this is that it's completely possible that the states that were negative were excluded because they were going to be negative anyway, right? You could have a selection problem in this case. So how do we determine whether these negative opinions are a product of exclusion or actually the cause of exclusion? And I think the best way to do this is compare states with fairly similar views inside and outside of the summits. In this case, if you look at NAM states, so non-aligned movement states that are in the summits, and compare the non-aligned movement states that are outside of the summits, what you see is that the non-aligned movement states in the summits are fairly quiet about the summits. They will criticize them within the summits, but they're not the ones leading the charge against the summits in Vienna. By comparison, the non-aligned movement states outside of the summits are much more negative. They're the predominant detractors of the summit. More interestingly is what you see in non-aligned movement states. So particularly Austria, Malta, Estonia, and Portugal are all excluded from the summit despite trying to enter. And you can see in their 2016 IAEA ministerial statements a particular emphasis on the IAEA, an inclusive organization, as the important and sole body responsible for the negotiation of nuclear security issues. This is important because when you compare them directly to states that were involved, in this case, Hungary, Greece, Lithuania, it's hard to see how, absent exclusion, these states would have had significantly different preferences. The graph here to the left is a comparison of statements in the IAEA 2016 ministerial. We can talk about the coding later if you want, but generally, a positive reference to the Nuclear Security Summit will give you a 1. A negative reference or a specific reference on the IAEA is inclusive, gives you a -1. Otherwise, you get a 0. And what you see is actually the most negative groups is not the non-aligned movement states, but the non-aligned movement states who are excluded. And I think this suggests that the active exclusion itself is very important in generating this negative backlash. But we still face the question of, is it relevant at all, right? Malta doesn't have a ton of nuclear material. Does it matter at all if they're negative in the IAEA? And to this, I want to suggest that because the Nuclear Security Summit did a lot of work trying to move forward their initiatives afterwards, what you see is that the closer an organizational follow-on initiative is to the Nuclear Security Summit, the more problems it has in the broader community. And this also suggests that the backlash against the summit is tied to the process rather than just to the substance. So I'm going to just overview this really briefly. I can talk about more of this if anyone has questions afterwards, but generally, after the Nuclear Security Summit, there was 3 primary information circulars, which are IAEA documents that were designed to push forward the consensus and the agreements of the summit towards the broader community. They were explicitly and specifically designed to do this. And what you see is that the more associated an information circular is with the NSS, the more problems it has in the follow-on. So there's 3 information circulars. The first one, the one on nuclear security guidelines, 869, actually is directly tied into the summit. And it comes out of a summit agreement. It has a lot of the summit Sherpas and Sous Sherpas get together to try to advertise it, and it faces immediate backlash. A contemporary report published by the people trying to get it to spread out and gain more signatories specifically mention exclusion as the reason for many states' pushback against it. They state not only is one state explicitly using this, but many states are uncomfortable about signing on to what they see as an exclusionary initiative. The next information circular is the opposite story. You have, in the information circular that focused on HEU elimination, the primary state in charge of this, Norway, in this case separated the initiative almost entirely from the NSS, pushing forward a follow-on initiative that was the June 2018 symposium on the elimination of highly enriched uranium. They specifically co-sponsored this with the IAEA, despite an interview saying that it was specifically a Nuclear Security Summit commitment. The invitations to this summit specifically say you do not have to agree with the Nuclear Security Summit, you do not have to agree with the information circular in order to attend. And the chair's summary for this, an organization which took place only 2 years after a major multi-year US initiative, contains only one small mention of the Nuclear Security Summit in a bullet point on the last page. I would argue that the most prominent feature of the Nuclear Security Summit in this initiative is its absence. Consequently, it faced very little backlash over exclusion. The summit was, according to the people I've talked to, fairly successful, although some of the states present at the summit would mention the Nuclear Security Summit if they were part of it. It did not become a big part of proceedings. Finally, the Nuclear Security Summit also established a contact group, kind of a follow-on group, which was specifically meant to address the exclusion, specifically meant to draw in other states. And this had kind of mixed results. Some new states did join on, 3 to be specific, Luxembourg, Colombia, and Slovenia. But the organization has faced complaints of ineffectiveness, it's continuing to face complaints of exclusion, and many states feel as though it's inapplicable to influence future IAEA meetings. Moreover, because of frustrations over its lack of progress, many of the states who are part of it have begun to discuss the possibility of creating a smaller, more exclusionary group within the Nuclear Security Contact Group to improve efficacy. So what we see is that the more associated an initiative is with the NSS and the more explicitly associated it is, the more difficulty its proponents have getting excluded states to sign on. In contrast, those initiatives which are specifically and deliberately separated from the NSS don't face NSS-related backlash. Now, we could imagine that it is possible that states respond negatively to follow-on initiatives, not only because they have this negative opinion due to backlash, but also for instrumental reasons. They could be trying to increase the costs for future states to encourage future inclusion. If this is the case, you would expect them to be mitigated in their backlash given the chance to sign on to a current initiative. Because if your goal is to increase the cost for future inclusion, current inclusion should be a priority. That would suggest that you should see much more engagement in the nuclear security contact group than you do. And for this reason, I would suggest that this backlash, while may have some instrumental elements, is not purely instrumental, but also engages with this core idea of fairness and backlash against exclusion. Very finally, to conclude here, I just want to touch on how this relates to the future of nonproliferation regimes and the organizations to recreate out of them. Primarily, I want to say that the problem with the Nuclear Security Summit in this context is not with the substantive outcomes of the summit, which were considerable, but rather with the mismatch between the goals of the organization to extend nuclear security to a broader group of countries and the exclusionary form. More specifically, if you want to organize an institution with universal goals and you do it in a particular organization that's exclusionary, you face a potential for backlash. This is interesting in the case of the NSS because you have both substantive goals, which are specific nuclear security improvements that are both particularist and you see significant progress on, and you also have these relational goals. And that's where the organization begins to experience more problems. So what is the net effects of minilateralism, right? What is the net effects of this exclusion? As I've mentioned, they did experience significant progress on these smaller groups. I guess to answer this question, we have to ask ourselves, what would be the effect of extended membership? There was approximately 10 to 15 states who wanted to join the NSS, but were not allowed to by the US. So we have to ask ourselves, what is the substantive difference in outcomes between a nuclear security summit with 50 states and one with 60 to 65 states? I would suggest that that difference is limited. The primary outcomes of the Nuclear Security Summit, many of the commitments that were made are not made on consensus mechanisms. The summit communiques are not the primary vehicle by which progress is achieved, but rather the opt-in organization of gift baskets and the individual national commitments, both of which would not be harmed by a larger effect, is where you see the largest progress. For this reason, I mean to suggest that smaller is not always better, and our inherent, almost instinctual emphasis on smaller is somehow more efficient misses a mismatch between what outcomes we want to achieve and the form by which we achieve them. This is not to say that every organization should involve every state. There are many examples of international initiatives which are opt-in, which allow states to set forth, a smaller group of states to set forth an array of principles and then allow states to sign on. When I discussed this with Ambassador Laura Holgate, she brought up specifically the example of the Global Health Security Agenda, which is an opt-in organization where states can sign on if they're willing to fulfill or hold to certain principles. It has roughly 60 members. Most states don't have the capacity or interest to sign on to every issue area, and it is not necessarily that every issue area should include every state. But including a state that wants to attend and has a stake in the issue isn't necessarily going to hurt progress if our outcomes aren't all based on consensus. Finally, how does this relate to nonproliferation? Dr. Miller talked already about the 2020 Review Conference, about the modernization and nuclear arsenals, and I think that in many ways nuclear security has dropped off the agenda. It somehow seems as though the Nuclear Security Summit happened a long time ago, even though it only ended in 2016. The Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons represents the frustration of the non-aligned movement, of states who feel like they've been systematically excluded from these discussions for years, and it also has fallen by the wayside in many of our agenda. Now, proliferation in North Korea the end of the JCPOA are both incredibly important issues. But as we engage on these issues and as we move towards the 2020 Review Con, we need to be much more deliberate with how we advocate and how we engage interested third-party states, because this is not an issue that only affects the superpowers. Finally, I will just leave you with a quote from Eikenberry, and he says, "The future of minilateralism will hinge on the ability of these states, rising and falling, advanced and developing, northern and southern, to redistribute authority, negotiate new bargains, and generate collective leadership." Thank you.
Hello, my name is Eunjeong from Institute for National Security Strategy. I present from here. And today what I'm going to do is about challenges to NPT in 2019 this year, as I was asked. And I tried to focus North Korean case while I prepared some other parts, kind of global concerns on nuclear non-proliferation this year, but previous speakers already has mentioned and covered quite a lot. So I skip some parts of my presentation and read the focus on North Korean case. Lots of people discuss about North Korean issues in terms of nuclear non-proliferation ground. They believe the challenges are from outside of NPT. However, think about it. NPT, the problem of NPT has been long-seated, but challenges are always there, and is the problem from outside always? Perhaps there is a deficit, internal deficits of NPT inside. So in my presentation today, unlike other presentators, I try to focus on the internal side of NPT's failure. Okay, I skipped those parts. And basically, here are what I'm going to speak about. I believe that there are internal deficits unresolved in NPT system for a long time, and their problems actually deteriorate the current status of NPT system today. And this clearly shows in North Korea's denuclearization process. So I explain first in internal challenge. NPT's failure on North Korea has been well known. Okay, it has failed to detect or prevent nuclear weapon development of North Korea. And also, it failed to stop North Korea's withdrawal from the NPT. And also, it didn't succeed to develop its role in the denuclearization process of North Korea yet. So, so North Korea seems giving a lot of challenge to NPT system. But I believe that it is from poor assumptions on North Korea. It's not. I'm not giving an exemption to NPT about their failures. However, we academics seem to have a kind of mistakes or misperceptions on North Korea, misinformation about North Korea. There has been popular assumptions. First, North Korea is a clandestine kingdom which totally locked itself up. So which means little information is available for serious scholarship of North Korea. There was a popular excuse for academics that we cannot study North Korea properly. And second popular assumption was that North Korea is an irrational player who is difficult to predict. So there's another exemption for academics that, serious scholarship is impossible in the first round. However, I believe that we did a little cooperation or collaboration efforts among different studies between non-proliferation studies and North Korean studies. It is necessary because the two studies have a different nature. nuclear non-proliferation study tends to pursue kind of a universal values of nuclear non-proliferation. On the other hand, North Korean studies, they tend to emphasize the unique feature of North Korean case. So I think it is very necessary in this time, particularly in this time, to collaborate the two studies. I'd like to give you some examples. It is a study derived from Hyung-Min Kim, and this sociogram in 1960, based on the CIPRI arms transfer database. As you see, the red circle indicates DPRK, and sorry about that. Okay, here you go. So in the 1960s, the North Korea is in the margin of the sociogram in the networks of arms transfer, which means also they, if you see the arrow, it only receives arms from other countries, mainly Russia and East Germany at the time. And then next, in the 1980s, if you see the location and the density of network, and DPRK is quite densely connected, and it only goes into DPRK, but the arrow goes out of DPRK as well, which means the connection and the cooperation on arms transfer is actively involved in the global network. So as you see, it is very important that North Korea is not isolated as we imagined. Instead, is actively engaged in the global network of arms transfer. So that's how I'd like to argue that, well, it can be assumed that horizontal cooperation among non-nuclear states may have been strengthened since 1980s, further in exchange of some conventional weapons by this time. In fact, since the 1990s, North Korea has tried to neutralize international norms through its uncooperative attitude, which calls for a we formula. And this challenges nuclear non-proliferation norms, clearly. But, okay, if I add some more, the way of North Koreans playing around the nuclear non-proliferation norms is very unique, because since 1990s, the collapse of the Cold War, everyone, particularly strong powers, they started to bringing in norms, and they started to play with the normative politics. However, the weakest power, such as North Korea, they started to bring in power politics again. Well, I mean, perhaps it's a losing game for them, though. So there is a big clash between the two different games in politics area. So it's not only about nuclear non-proliferation regime's failure, but at the same time, it's a structural collision. So we need to take this account in. And here comes the external challenge as well around nuclear, around the North Korean nuclear issues. If I recall the past process, how denuclearization talks has been made around around North Korea. Okay, in 1994, the agreed framework. 2005 and 2007, we had the six-party talks, and we had a kind of a great deal of agreement, but never kept the promise. And 2018 and 2019, the denuclearization talks are ongoing. Unfortunately, we can't promise the bright future at the moment, but clearly we can see the limited space for NPT to play around. because as I mentioned again earlier, power politics and normative politics, the two different sets of politics minds are colliding in each state. So there was a little room. It's also the United States or North Korea. I mean, they are representing each of power politics and normative politics field. At the same time, they put a little credit on NPT. I think that's another issue, what players think about NPT. So the NPT has been eroded in many aspects, but not only from the structural limitations, but also players' perceptual dimensions as well. So next slide shows little political leverage available for NPT during this denuclearization process. Well, the order can vary according to the analyst, but here are key elements of what we discuss on North Korea's denuclearization process. Okay, and then the United States always insisted to North Korea come back to NPT system. However, it always failed. Why? Because NPT system strike such a sensitive points of North Korea that North Korea can never accept. As you know, North Korea insists their status as a nuclear state, just as America. But it's not acceptable for North Korea, it's not acceptable for America, of course, and other states. And such a big stake in NPT, then North Korea can never go progress in the denuclearization process. So in such a big gap between the two countries in the summits, here goes CTBTO Executive Secretary. He visited a few times since last year, I first met, and Mr. Lassina Zurbo, he provided a kind of a policy suggestion that North Korea can be encouraged to join the CTBTO before NPT to provide a kind of a sincerity, credibility, to guarantee I'm really serious about. At least, actually, well, North Korea, as you know, has declared that we will give up the test anyway. So the barriers to enter into CTBTO system could be easier for North Korea. So this can be an option. But why not NPT why not NPT Secretary General think about such a flexible option? I think that's a matter of creativity of policy area. So little effort from NPT becomes problematic as well from my side of view. And I'll provide a brief analysis and a policy suggestion. So I believe that NPT system has been particularly ineffective in dealing with the North Korean case because analytical negligence from poor assumptions has made on North Korea. And it was also due to a wide perceptional gap between nuclear countries and nuclear ambition countries in terms of how to play in nuclear non-proliferation fields, such as politics of norms versus power politics, and so on. And so I'd like to suggest kind of matchmaking or bridging the two different logics and two different fields of North Korean studies and nuclear non-proliferation studies. and also normative politics between power politics. To combine 1 and 2, and NPT needs to expand its knowledge of the nature of the North Korean regime and power politics around the North Korean denuclear progress. So I think it is important, to be more effective. Okay, well, so far it has been ineffective, but to catch up, I think NPT needs to plan ahead of the denuclearization process and promote the need of a global labor division once nuclear denuclearization process is on board. So also, I suggested a CTBTO took initiative in progressing denuclearization process at the moment. But I don't think it is necessary to compete or conflict to other NGOs or IOs. NPT can take lead of cooperative manner with the IOs, other IOs, such as the CTBTOs, who are taking initiative now in Korean government. So I think NPT has been criticized a lot, but to avoid such a criticism in future, not to repeat such flaws, NPT needs to step up from the reformation of inside institution. And also they need to think ahead about what they can do in North Korean denuclearization process. This is the way they can survive. Thank you.
I will open up the session to the audience, but before we do that, I would like to ask Professor Sagan one question. One of the issues we wanted to talk about is emerging technologies and so on. I know Professor Sagan's son works in an industry where special purpose drones are manufactured and used. And that's an example, a miniature drone deployed for whatever special mission. I think these are examples of technologies emerging, and we basically see a world with technical latency increasing significantly. So what do you think is the implications of these emerging technologies from your point of view? We have a session dedicated tomorrow with technical expertise, so we'll have more discussion on this, but I think from our perspective, how would you perceive that? How would you look at it from IR point of view?
Well, I wasn't expecting this question, so I don't have any kind of prepared answer. I would just note that the technologies that could help detect a cheater is what we're really talking about. And the IAEA, in my view, actually did detect and demonstrated its strength with respect to both North Korea by seeing what was taken out of the Eunjeong reactor, and showed its strength with Iran by showing that there were some illicit activities that took place. New drone technology in terms of surveillance drones, advanced verification on reactors, all of these things will help the IAEA, but I don't see how it can totally avoid the problem of some states working behind the scenes in underground facilities. Even with the best technologies, I suspect there's going to be some cheating. And what's going to make this worse is that countries that have acquired weapons through illegal means, that is, that they did this while they were members of the NPT, rather than somebody who we may not like that India got nuclear weapons, but they didn't, well, they did do some cheating, but they didn't cheat on the NPT itself, that those countries are now developing their capabilities to share technology in very negative ways. So when we talk about the dangers from North Korea, one of the dangers we've already seen, which is what they did with Syria. They are probably doing a lot with Iran today as well. Now, extra technology might help us detect some of that, but it's not going to tell us what we can do once we detect it. That requires political will. And so I'm all in favor of these technologies that help with verification and detection, but I don't think they solve the basic problem about after detection, then what?
So we'll have that discussion tomorrow morning with some of the best experts in the field. I'd like to open up the floor to the audience. Any questions you may have, please raise your hand and identify who you are. Yes, Donghyun Kim, and here, and then David, and then Mohammed, yes. And then Professor Chan. Let's go with that order first.
Thank you. I have two questions. First one to Professor Sagan and second question to Leah. So Professor Sagan, you mentioned about the arms control, the necessity of arms control in the short to the medium term with the DPRK. But when you say arms control, are you specifically referring to an arms control between US and DPRK? So can you tell us a little bit more about the format or the details of your arms control, especially when there is a factor of China as well? To Leah, thank you for your really interesting framework about the process versus the outcome. I want to bring you back to the NPT and whether you see that the outcome of the NPT itself, the failure of the NPT. Okay, sorry. So when you bring your framework back to the NPT, do you see that the outcome of the NPT is itself a problematic, or do you see the problem of the process of the NPT? Thank you.
And we'll actually deplete the first 5 questions and then have the speakers answer those questions.
Good afternoon. My name is David Guerre, a master student from the Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden. The New START treaty is about to expire, and as far as I know, there is no signs that it could be renewed, since the US wants China to get also involved into the agreement, but China says that their arsenal is much smaller to be considered into the treaty. Also, recently the US has withdrawn from the short and intermediate missile treaty, saying that Russia has violated the treaty many times. And in the news, they are starting to talk about a new Cold War. And Mr. President Trump has mentioned that the US is willing to outspend and acquire better technology than any other country. So my question is that are we really getting close to a new Cold War, but now with 3 sides, now that China has a economical position to also be a really important member in this Cold War, and how this will affect the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, and also the China and Iran cooperation. How is also this going to affect the negotiations? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Mohammed Abdul Hamid, research assistant, American University of Cairo, Egypt. Professor Miller has touched the issues of current interest in non-proliferation and nuclear security. However, as a Middle Eastern, I am more concerned about the what-if questions. What if ISIS has acquired nuclear weapons? They are transparent to the system. They have more mobilization. As far as I'm concerned, we don't see much literature or much policy talks about this issue. However, it's of concern to us. Thank you.
Let me begin with a question to Professor Dingli. And after this withdrawal from the INF, US was saying that they are ready to deploy conventional intermediate range missiles, not the nuclear intermediate range missiles for the moment. But what would you guess the consequences of having intermediate conventional missiles in Guam is okay, but what about in Japan and Korea and other areas in the region? And my second question goes to Dr. Steve Miller and Scott Sagan, to both. We heard that the Libyan model is the worst case that we could apply to the DPRK. But what is your guess about the best model or case we could apply to the DPRK? If there is any comparable historical cases, we have a very successful denuclearization of Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and South Africa, but also we have a very unsuccessful case of Pakistan, Israel, and India. So what will be the future of DPRK? If you see the future 10, 20 years, how do you see the future of DPRK, and what will be the best case, historical case we could apply to the DPRK? And my last question goes to Scott Sagan, who said earlier that living with the nuclear North Korea is another option we have to consider for the moment. And also he added that the danger of a preventive or any military strike, we have to think about consequences. And my question is that living with nuclear North Korea also has a very serious consequences. As you know, in South Korea, somehow, because of this very hostile or adverse security environment, there is unusually high public support for nuclear armament, despite the government that says no nuclear weapon policy, very firm policy. So if there is some position of living with the nuclear North Korea, they could ignite some, domestic South Korean responses to this nuclear armament debate again, and also some conflicts dominate in the region. And also, if we are ready to live with the nuclear North Korea, that's going to, kind of acknowledge DPRK's military or nuclear superiority. That is the kind of message that we are getting whenever those issues are raised. But on the other hand, I also fully agree with you and support your position of step-by-step approach, because altogether once for is not working.
Start from Professor Sagan. We go this way.
Well, those were complex and great questions. I don't think I'm going to be as thorough as I would like to be, so that other people can speak. But let me first answer the very first question about trying to spell out in a little bit more detail about the mechanisms by which potential arms control agreement could take place. I think here the United States can be faulted for not consulting its allies. If there was any kind of formal agreement spelling out what kinds of exercises are quotes unquote provocative and which kinds are defensive and therefore potentially allowed, clearly the ROK and the Japanese government would have to be brought in as partners. That was not the case when the agreement, or at least the statement, was made at Singapore. If it makes South Koreans feel better to when you think that you were not consulted, it is also true that the Defense Department of the United States was not consulted. That was the president making what one person involved told me he was making an audible. He was changing the rules the way a quarterback in American football makes an audible and changes everything and surprises everybody because of his own views about exercises. If there was anything formal, it would obviously have to bring in our allies. That would also be true, especially true for my idea about having dangerous military activities be a formal agreement. I think it is important not to put all of our arms control eggs in one basket, that is, put it all with respect to step-by-step denuclearization, to have other things where militaries are talking to each other, to say, look, we're going to have patrols, we want to make sure that there's not an incident. That would be very useful to have the ROK, DPRK, US, and potentially other states involved, so you don't have an incident at sea, or if there is, for example, a plane that drifts into another side's territory that's not shot down, that there are emergency signals that can be accepted by all. That should be multilateral at all as well. The one area where I'm not 100% convinced that multilateralism makes sense, and maybe Leah's very helpful presentation makes me think about this. On the one hand, if there was some kind of a deal, if the United States could pocket the concession about the Eunjeong facility that reportedly was offered by the DPRK in exchange for some kind of release of sanctions, on the one hand, it would be useful to have others who are involved in sanctions make the agreement. That would be a multilateral, would stop the unfairness. On the other hand, then you'd get into negotiations with the Russians and the Chinese about exactly what sanctions could be lifted and what can't. And that can't happen very quickly. So I think sometimes there's a trade-off between the desire for inclusivity to get something done and the desire for, if not universality, a much broader. And there I have to think a lot more about the question of whether it's worth it to have all the other sanctioning states through the UN Security Council be involved in that kind of a trade regime. Lastly, I appreciate these comments about historical analogies and about the danger of living with nuclear North Korea. Remember, I'm the guy who took the anti-proliferation position in the long-standing debate that I had. But I do want to say that this is a deeply imperfect analogy. But the two analogies I would make for the potential with North Korea are both South Africa and the collapse of the Soviet Union. South Africa is the only state that voluntarily gave up weapons that it itself had built and that it had control of. It did it not just because the threat had changed, I believe, but because it saw an internal regime change happening and didn't want, when that happened, to have nuclear weapons involved in the mix in case something went bad domestically, or they didn't want to burden the new government with having to negotiate this, or potentially having the ANC have its own weapons and try to figure out what to do with them. So they cut up the weapons themselves and put the material into storage at the Pelindaba facility. That suggests that the only reason I could see North Korea in the future is if regime change was so likely that it decided that it didn't want to have a reform government coming forward. They didn't want to have nuclear weapons there to manage that. That could be in a unification scheme, or it could be an independent regime change going forward. The containment with the Soviet Union I raised because, to me, we need to couple our vision of a long-term disarmament with continuing to contain some aggressive actions that the North Koreans occasionally maintain. And remember, containment with the arms control that was practiced during the Cold War was not an acceptance that the Soviet Union would stay there forever. It was saying that it has internal contradictions, and we are going to maintain both arms control to manage the rivalry and strong deterrence to prevent potential aggression from that state until it collapses of its own internal problems. Now that is an imperfect analogy, and it's one that has dangers because the state collapsing with nuclear weapons is not necessarily a good thing as well. But I think those are the two historical analogies that are worth at least considering.
The first question addressed to me had to do with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and whether this has the potential to undermine the NPT. For those of you who don't follow it, this is a treaty that was passed in the UN General Assembly a couple of years ago supported by some 120 states, already ratified by several dozen, although not yet enough to bring the treaty into force. This was negotiated over a period of months and fiercely opposed by all of the nuclear weapon states, spearheaded by the United States. The concern is that this process has intensified the division between the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states, and introduced another specific point of contention in the relationship between the haves and the have-nots. And the worry is that this will complicate the future politics of the NPT system. That's a very short answer there. On the withdrawal clause, this is a very interesting question. Article 10 of the NPT gives every state the legal right to withdraw when it itself judges that its interests require it. There's no adjudicatory process, there's no body that's required to bless or authorize this. The state is only required to provide notification and explanation. So this is a permissive withdrawal clause, but very similar to what exists in most international treaties, because states rarely are prepared to bind themselves in perpetuity to any particular set of negotiated arrangements. In response to concerns about countries like North Korea and Iran, there's been real interest in either finding ways of strengthening Article 10, making it more conditional, or some have argued that the near universality of the NPT, that is to say almost every state is a member, it has 189 member states, and the overweening importance of preventing proliferation means that perhaps Article 10 should be suspended, that the right of withdrawal should be abrogated. And in the United States, there's been an interest in finding ways of making Article 10 conditional, at least to the point where states that exercise the right of withdrawal are forced to give up all nuclear technology that they obtained under Article 4 of the NPT. These proposals, however, are denounced and opposed by the overwhelming majority of the NPT members. And so in principle, it's an idea that has attraction to people who are passionately committed to nonproliferation, but in practice, it appears to be impossible to implement. And in fact, I think most people believe that most of the NPT would not be achievable if we had to try and negotiate it today, and trying to change it is very, very difficult. The question about are we entering a new Cold War and is it more complex than the past? I think we're evolving into a more triangular world when you think about great power relations. It's going to be China, Russia, and America in a complicated dance. You see some of the implications in the comments of Dingli Shen, where he pointed out that China has its own perspective on the Iran crisis, its own relations with Iran, its own transactional interests with Iran, and they're not prepared to defer completely to the preferences of Washington. Well, this greatly confounds American policy vis-a-vis Iran. This is a huge escape valve for Iran and a big problem for the United States. So I think that's going to be increasingly a feature of the future of great power relations. I'd add just the one additional thought, which is certainly in Washington, it's China way more than Russia that is now viewed as the principal rival, the principal challenger to American power and influence in the decades ahead. Mohammed, you raised the question about ISIS and the possibility of non-state actors with the bomb. And that's, you're right, a huge and important subject. There's a lot to say and not time to say it, but I'll just state briefly that after the big attacks on the United States on September 11th, 2001, the great fear of the American national security establishment was the notion of a nuclear 9/11. And President George W. Bush said many times, one of his more common utterances, that the biggest threat to American security was the world's most dangerous weapons in the hands of the world's most dangerous people, meaning terrorists. So I would say that countering nuclear terrorism is one of the centerpieces of American external policy for at least a dozen, maybe 15 years in the aftermath of 9/11. What was done about it, some of it, of course, was aggressive efforts to target terrorist groups, but the main line of axis was actually intersecting directly with Leah's presentation, and it was rooted in the premise, no fissile material, no weapons, right? If you can lock up the material and keep it out of the hands of bad guys, they can't get or make a weapon. And so there are strenuous efforts and billions of dollars spent doing what came to be known in the Obama administration as a global cleanout, which had to do with identifying and raising the level of security of every inventory of weapons usable material anywhere in the world, no matter how small or large the challenge was in each particular country. And over the nearly 20 years since 9/11, a lot of progress has been made in removing, eliminating, or improving the security of weapons usable material. That's been the main approach.
It's perfectly understandable why some country want my country to be a part of a global INF, because we are used to a categorized security and threat reduction. When we feel small weapon constitute a threat, let's do small weapon convention. When we feel laser weapon a threat, let's do laser weapon. When we feel strategic weapon a threat, let's do START. When we feel INF a threat, let's do INF. It's totally understandable. And you have a right to join, and you have a right to leave. At the time when INF was made, China was nothing. China had a few nuclear weapons and a few conventional tipped missiles, including conventional intermediate range missiles. So China is not a part of the play. The major rivals were the US and the then Soviet Union. They have to do this categorized threat reduction. And China welcomed. China benefited. But China need to build a certain nuclear INF because we have enemy. They have nuclear INF, sea-based. They may no longer have any kind of land-based, but they have sea-based. And they can put the sea-based close to China, deploy these weapons in Japan and in other places which is close to China. And they can sail too close to China. And we don't have lots of mobile system to put our INF on our sea-based system. So we have to put them on the land. That does not mean we want to counter the global expectation. That means we want to counter the US persistent threat to arm Taiwan. US helped us to revert Taiwan from Japan. And the US has kept weapon sales to Taiwan even after reverting its diplomacy from Taipei to Beijing. So we feel threatened. As you feel threatened, you need America. But American based in South Korea make us feel threatened. So we have this kind of complicated regional and global security dilemma. Your security could be our threat. Our security could be your threat. Even though we don't want to mean to threat you, but we need to counter. We need to prepare for certain contingency in which some nasty things would happen across Taiwan Strait. We don't expect the US and China would exchange strategic arms. And we don't expect China and US would exchange even intermediate range nuclear arms. But we need to be ready and fight and win with a conventional war, in which China need to use its conventional INF to make a deal with the US. But this conventional missile could also be tipped with nuclear weapon. Therefore, with China's growing capacity to handle the US in West Pacific, American feels upset. They are going to leave INF to handle China. China has enough capability to handle the US now. China has too much money. US cannot win a conventional INF race with China. And China wants to beat the US if the US would defend Taiwan independence. These days we have Hong Kong independence. And these two independence can be intertwined, backed by the US. So war is not unlikely, and you don't want to join a global INF to disarm China. Then China could be defeated by US with strategic weapon and with conventional and nuclear-tipped intermediate range weapon. You don't want to be defeated. And it's a part of China. Why we cannot deter Taiwan independence? We don't want to fight a war with Taiwan, but we cannot allow Taiwan to announce de jure independence, and America may be behind it. Given this, the traditional notion of categorized arms reduction and threat reduction need to be replaced by integrated security system. That strategic arms, conventional arms, and intermediate nuclear and conventional arms should be put together, not just one category, but together. So America would feel secure, and they don't need to leave INF. And China would feel secure if America would abandon Taiwan Relation Act and the Taiwan Security Reassurance Act. Then China may be more willing to participate in a global expanded INF. Short of this, I really have difficulty in persuading my government.
Okay, I know it's lunchtime, so I'll be brief. On the question about the NPT, you asked whether the outcome or the process of the NPT was problematic. And I would say neither are inherently problematic, and the reason, in fact, I would argue for the long-standing legitimacy of the NPT and its status as a central pillar of really international organizations. It's one of the best examples of a long-standing international treaty does come from this early bargain between the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states, and the perception among both that there was a fair trade made. And many of the problems we face now are perhaps more on the failures to follow through on that bargain, particularly on the outcome side. So in the US, we tend to focus on criticisms about cheating, about potential proliferators, but there is also among particularly non-aligned movement states criticisms of the installation of a permanent second-class status, the failure of the nuclear weapon states to further disarm. I want to draw attention to procedural issues, particularly because as we look at bargains like the NPT, one of the reasons why they are so long-standing is because there's a lot of institutional buy-in among states. And as we seek to address concerns with the NPT over outcomes, we also have to address these in a way that includes multiple voices if we want those fixes to also be long-standing. On Scott's point of bringing sanctioned states into negotiations, I think the question we have to ask is, does both the legitimacy and the outputs of the regime depend on the participation of the larger group? So you might imagine that negotiating a reduction of sanctions with North Korea would be more difficult with Russia and China at the table. I'm sure it would be. But if we were to pursue unilateral reductions of sanctions with North Korea, we would then have to go and pursue Russia and China compliance. There is significant international effort around the sanctions regime, but also significant criticism over lax enforcement among those states. So I'm not particularly sure that, given that you have to enlist their compliance and any further addition of sanctions or reduction of sanctions, excluding them from the initial negotiations might have a potential for increasing institutional buy-in within those states to implement them. That's all.
Thank you. We have a session dedicated to North Korean issues right after lunch, so I'm sure we'll have a more meaningful and in-depth discussion on North Korea after lunch. But before we conclude, I wanted to make an observation. We have President Trump in the United States. We have Chairman Xi Jinping in China. We have Putin in Russia. We have Kim Jong-un. All these strong men. And then now we have Prime Minister Abe in Japan, another very strong man. And President Moon Jae-in is trying to be very strong as well. So we are getting into a very interesting world. Yesterday we had a little discussion among some of our scholars. What if President Trump is re-elected? Well, there is a chance, and I think Steve Miller mentioned that he is unleashed. He is now surrounded by all the puppets, and he is empowered to do whatever he wants to do, which he didn't really exercise in his first term, which means the world is becoming more dangerous, and the United States may start doing more crazy things. So how do we prepare ourselves? I think the thing that we see right now, what's happening between South Korea and Japan, is an example of what could happen, the trade war, which only helps North Korea in a bad way. So we're living in a very interesting world. I don't think we can find a solution to that problem. I don't think, even if we share all the expertise, we don't exactly know how to prepare for the upcoming world. But important thing is people. I think people understand each other and share the same values, behave in altruistic manner. I think things could change. I'm not an IR person, but whenever I look at the issues of IR, I feel like the reason why I don't want to become an IR person. International relations is very childish. They behave like a child, a baby. Self-interest only, national interest only. I think we should be an adult. Better understand each other. That's the only way we can solve the problems, I think. Right after lunch, there is a poster presentation out there, but then there will be 5 ladies and gentlemen. They are NEREC research fellows. They work for 1 year under NEREC sponsorship on some of the problems of non-proliferation. And they will be presenting their posters, and they'll be waiting for you to come. And we ask everybody to listen to what they have to say and vote for the best research poster among the 5. So it's not a huge challenge. So hopefully you all participate in that. And after lunch, I think we will have a very interesting session coming up on North Korea. So please stay tuned. And I'd like to thank all the sponsors who made this conference happen possible. Although it's listed in our booklets and so on, Minister of Foreign Affairs is not listed, so I should say it. Minister of Foreign Affairs, one of the important sponsors, is not listed on. Minister of Science and ICT is an important sponsor. National Research Foundation is an important sponsor. Korea Hydro and Nuclear Power Company very generously sponsored this event, and also Korea International Cooperation, Nuclear and Information Cooperation Foundation also sponsored heavily on this sponsor. So, and then Stanford Foundation of the United States also is a sponsor for this event. So we appreciate all the help and support from the sponsors. With that, I would like to conclude the session. Thank you very much.